Welcome to the debate. Our discussion today really hits on that universally frustrating gap between ambition and actually getting things done. Drawing from the source material's advice for tackling that paralyzing state of inaction we often just call laziness.
Mm-hmm. And it's a critical topic because, the material offers this very clear, almost mechanical escape route for ambitious people who stall out simply because their goals feel, just impossibly large. We've all been there, right? Big vision, zero daily traction.
Exactly. And that very practical approach, that's really the core of our question today. When you're tackling these big, long-term objectives, is overcoming that inertia, that feeling of being stuck, is it primarily solved by these strict tactical simplification methods, breaking tasks down, setting up automatic routines, using those low-friction starting rules? Or do these behavioral mechanics, which are, let's face it, undeniably useful, do they actually fall short? Do they miss something deeper, maybe cognitive or motivational, that you need for truly sustained, impactful change?
Right. And I'm going to argue that, yes, these tactics are fantastic for starting, for getting the engine running, indispensable even. But ultimately, I think they're insufficient on their own to build the necessary durability, the resilience you need to sustain the really complex, multi-year efforts that big dreams demand.
And I'm taking the opposite view. I argue that these tactical steps, they aren't just starting blocks. They are the entire engine. They're the only truly reliable path to producing significant results. I believe the source material provides a complete and frankly sufficient blueprint for transforming that avoidance into real, consistent progress. So my core thesis is this. What we see as laziness isn't some deep character flaw. It's more like a learned habit. It's rooted in our basic neurological wiring, right? Our brains are designed to conserve energy, they signal pain when a task feels too big, and we naturally pivot to comfort. The ingenious solution offered here is basically to stop trying to negotiate with your motivation, and instead sort of outsmart your own brain by making the task mechanically, almost ridiculously easy to start.
Okay, and specifically, how does the material suggest we neutralize this fundamental resistance?
Well, it relies on a pretty straightforward sequential approach that essentially lowers the energy needed to start down to almost zero. First, you have to simplify the scale, make it small. Focus on small wins. So if your goal is, say, a huge 200-page report, you commit to writing just one sentence today. That's it. The emphasis is entirely on progress, not perfection. Whether it's, one simple guitar chord or just cleaning one corner of a messy room, these are the small steps up the mountain. They compound, they accumulate.
Mm-hmm.
Second, you've got to prioritize automaticity through routines. Willpower, as the material rightly points out, is finite. It runs out. So relying on it day after day, that pretty much guarantees failure eventually. Success really hinges on turning actions into automatic habits, essentially using routines like training wheels that just eliminate the need for conscious effort. And then finally, the sort of core tactic is that low-friction start rule, the commitment to just 2 minutes of effort. We all know the hardest part of any task is just getting started. So by committing to only 2 minutes, you bypass that huge psychological barrier where the task feels overwhelming. And often, once those 2 minutes are up, the action, having overcome that initial inertia, it just naturally wants to, roll on its own. That consistency delivered through these small, sometimes imperfect efforts, that's how major accomplishments are actually realized.
Okay, I definitely see the immediate appeal of that framework. It's very concrete. But let me offer a slightly different perspective, especially when we think about the long haul, long-term application. I completely agree these are excellent mechanisms for initiation, fantastic for getting started, but I do challenge their sufficiency for a sustained long-term commitment. My concern is that the framework focuses almost entirely on reducing the external friction, making it easy to start, without really adequately addressing the internal source of the resistance.
Why do you see them as insufficient, though? I mean, if they successfully neutralize the friction, that causes the block in the first place?
Well, because I think they rely perhaps a bit too heavily on environmental cues, on priming, and maybe even on instant gratification to make starting feel good. For instance, the material encourages using external rewards, like, listening to a favorite song right after you start to incentivize the action. And this focus on external gratification, it might not cultivate the kind of deep intrinsic commitment that's necessary when goals get really complex or they require delayed gratification, or frankly, when they're just inherently difficult and not very fun. Think about what the material itself acknowledges, that underlying conceptual barrier. Saving money feels like cutting back on everything. Training for a marathon feels like signing up for chronic exhaustion. Simply shrinking the task down to saving $1 today or running for just 2 minutes, it doesn't actually eliminate that underlying feeling, that concept of deprivation or exhaustion that's tied to the ultimate difficult goal. The training wheels are great for the first 2 minutes, sure, but what happens when you actually have to run 5 miles and it's raining?
But that's precisely why the mechanics matter. You don't wait for the feeling. You initiate the action regardless of the feeling.
Okay, routines and these low-friction starts, they're excellent for getting the ball rolling. I grant you that. But I don't think they provide the necessary internal structure, the mental scaffolding, maybe, to persevere through inevitable failure. And the material itself notes failure is, quote, part of the journey. So my central question really is whether this kind of tactical simplicity provides the psychological durability needed for recovery, for sustained effort over years, especially, once the initial novelty of the trick wears off.
All right, let's tackle that durability critique head on. Let's focus on our first point, the mechanism of consistency versus the liability of relying on willpower. You're claiming the tactics are insufficient, but the source material, I think, correctly identifies the core human flaw. Relying on willpower day in, day out guarantees failure because that resource is it's finite. It gets depleted by everyday life.
I understand the skepticism towards willpower as a constant driver, I do. But the material proposes replacing that daily drain with routine momentum, with structure like, writing a to-do list every morning or drinking water right when you wake up. My contention is that maintaining the structure itself still requires ongoing willpower, maybe a different kind, to keep its integrity against, life's general chaos and entropy.
How so? The whole point is automation.
Well, I suppose I don't fully buy that willpower is entirely removed from the equation. Here's why. Setting up the routine in the first place, making that conscious, deliberate decision to, say, put your running shoes by the bed, that is a focused, high-effort exercise of willpower, isn't it? And if the initial mental block, that feeling that the task is structurally too hard, if that's deeply rooted in avoiding cognitive pain, then maybe a mere physical prompt isn't always enough to sustain high-quality engagement once that 2-minute novelty period is over. The habit might be established, sure, but the underlying pain avoidance mechanism hasn't necessarily been rewired. It's just been sort of sidestepped.
That's an interesting point, though I might frame it a bit differently. I'd say the creation of the routine is more of a one-time or maybe occasional investment of that higher-level willpower, and it's designed specifically to eliminate the daily drain on willpower. Once the routine is established, the action becomes largely automatic, and the cognitive load needed just to start is essentially gone. We're focusing on making the action effortless, not waiting around for the feeling of motivation to strike. And furthermore, the moment you actually start taking action, that behavioral momentum kicks in almost immediately. This is the core cognitive shift the source material really points towards. That low-friction commitment turns what felt like a frightening task into something trivial. And that's often enough to leverage, the Zeigarnik effect, that psychological thing where unfinished tasks kind of mentally nag at us until they're done. Starting creates a sort of cognitive open loop that actually encourages you to continue. So the mechanism isn't just physical inertia. It's leveraging how our brains respond to incomplete action.
Okay, I accept the power of the Zeigarnik effect, at least in theory. But that actually leads us perfectly into the next point, the scope and the limits of these small wins. While I absolutely agree with the principle of progress, not perfection, I do worry about the scalability, especially when you apply it to really complex skills. You hold
That the accumulated efforts of, say, one sentence a day or one guitar chord every day, that this is the only path to achieving a truly transformative result.
I do, yes. You can't just leap to the top of the mountain. You have to take one small step and then another. Consistently adding small bits of fuel is what makes the fire roar eventually. I genuinely believe it's the only reliable way massive goals are realized because it ensures consistency, and consistency is almost always the single ingredient missing when people stall out.
That's a compelling metaphor. The fire, and it makes sense based on volume of effort. But have you considered the type of cognitive load required for genuine mastery? Is the conceptual difficulty of achieving that roaring fire, let's say becoming proficient in something really tough like advanced physics or a complex programming language, is that difficulty truly addressed by reducing the daily task to a practically negligible action? What I'm arguing is that for goals needing significant cognitive effort, deep concentration, relying perpetually on the absolute lowest barrier to entry, might lead to consistent surface-level activity, sure, but maybe without the deep, sometimes uncomfortable engagement necessary for true mastery. Imagine trying to learn calculus by only reading the title of one section each day. Or trying to write a novel by only focusing on crafting one perfectly structured sentence. You check the box for the habit, yes, but you might be actively avoiding the sustained, focused discomfort that's actually required for intellectual growth. Does that low-friction start risk conditioning you to only seek trivial engagement?
I'm not entirely convinced by that line of reasoning, because the structure itself doesn't forbid deep work. It only insists on an easy start. That 2-minute commitment is purely solely designed to overcome inertia. Once that inertia is overcome, often the inherent satisfaction of actually doing productive work takes over. If you commit to reading just one page, chances are you might find yourself reading 3 or 6, and then maybe you do enter a state of deeper concentration. Consistently delivering on that minimal promise, that builds the habit. And the habit is what creates the space, the opportunity for massive change to occur. The tactical simplicity is just the necessary key to unlock the productive session. We're fundamentally talking about eliminating inaction, which means immediate commencement has to be paramount. The quality of deep concentration needed for mastery, well, that's kind of irrelevant if you never even start the task in the first place.
Immediate commencement is essential, I agree. But let's shift to our third point, how we're defining and solving this laziness. You seem to insist on a very practical definition. If tasks feel scary or impossible, the solution must be to make them small and easy. This practical, almost mechanical intervention, you argue, is the single most effective way to change the habit.
It is. The emphasis has to be on immediate commencement. Don't wait for motivation. Don't wait for the perfect moment. Start now. The material provides a clear, actionable intervention for the person struggling with avoidance. And avoidance is the immediate, practical problem we're trying to solve.
Okay, I agree everyone struggles, and these are definitely powerful first steps. But if the brain really is wired to avoid the pain associated with monumental tasks, then maybe the long-term solution has to eventually involve restructuring the perception of that pain itself, not just perpetually avoiding the confrontation through a 2-minute workaround. True consistency. Over the long haul, it demands confronting the difficulty, internalizing the value of the struggle, maybe even accepting discomfort as just an integral part of the process. If you continuously trivialize the task simply to avoid the pain, are you actually learning how to cope when the pain becomes unavoidable?
But I'd argue that psychological shift, the restructuring the perception of pain, that happens through the repeated successful action. Every small win, every little 2-minute start, it triggers the reward pathway in the brain. This essentially, you could say, tricks the brain into associating the previously painful task with a small reward, a dopamine hit. By consistently engaging via this low-friction start, you actually begin to fundamentally rewire that pain association, making the subsequent engagement feel easier, maybe even more appealing over time. So the tactical steps aren't just avoiding pain, they're the catalyst for the deeper cognitive shift you're looking for. They're like a practical application of exposure therapy for behavioral avoidance.
I see why you emphasize that practical rewiring through those dopamine hits.
It makes sense biochemically, but I still worry about the vulnerability that might remain. If the entire foundation relies on trivialization and these environmental prompts, does that tactical approach really provide the philosophical resilience needed to get back up and try again after a significant major failure? The source material itself acknowledges failure is inevitable. So when you've invested, say, 6 months into a routine, and then you hit a catastrophic setback, a project fails spectacularly, you suffer a serious injury, a financial disaster hits, does the simple instruction to put your shoes by the bed still hold water? Does it provide the internal why that's necessary to reboot the entire effort? Sustaining commitment after a major setback that often requires a deeper, more internalized value system, something that transcends mere behavioral mechanics.
You almost need the motivation to seek out discomfort again, not just the habit that helps you avoid it.
But it still requires action to recover, which these steps ensure. The consistency built through that easy start provides a foundation of habit strength that can actually help survive setbacks. When failure strikes, often that consistent behavior, that mechanical habit, is one of the last things to fall away, potentially making the recovery much quicker than if you were relying solely on some abstract feeling of motivation. So, to summarize my position, the path to major accomplishment, it really is paved with consistency. And consistency is built most reliably through the simple mechanics of making tasks small, establishing automatic routines, and using these low-friction commencement tactics like the 2-minute rule. We really cannot wait for motivation. We have to engineer action. And these mechanics are sufficient because over time, they fundamentally rewire the habit of avoidance into one of execution. The real power lies in taking action today, consistently, no matter how small that initial effort feels.
And I would maintain that while these steps are truly excellent starting points for overcoming that initial inertial barrier, and everyone should probably use them, the listener should also recognize that sustained commitment to complex, large goals often requires more. It requires addressing those deeper cognitive or maybe motivational barriers that cause the task to feel so overwhelming in the first place. The ultimate goal shouldn't just be to maintain a shallow habit, but maybe to cultivate a more robust internal commitment, one that allows you to tolerate, even embrace, the inevitable difficulty and pain that mastery requires. You need the tools to start, absolutely, but you also likely need the internal structure to ensure those training wheels can eventually come off.
Well, I think what we've established is the undeniable value of using this kind of tactical simplicity to initiate action. That seems clear. While perhaps maintaining an awareness, as you suggest, that the sheer complexity of large goals does require continued cognitive investment for that long-term resilience.
Indeed. The material gives us substantial, immediate paths for action, and it certainly prompts listeners to explore the limits and the possibilities of these behavioral mechanics for themselves. Thank you for this discussion.